Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for this webinar is Solar Equipment Installation and Licensing and Certification, a guide for states and municipalities. This webinar is a presentation of the Sustainable Solar Education Project, which is managed by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, and supported by the U.S. Department of Energy's Sunshot Initiative. Our host for this webinar is CESA Project Director Nate Hausman, and we have two excellent guest speakers with us today. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our participants for this webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of this webinar. You can call in using a telephone, or you can connect using your computer's mic and speakers. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions as you think of them throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hitting send. We'll read through your questions as they come in, and we're going to save some time at the end of our presentations for a Q&A with the audience. So to make sure that we get to your question, it's important to type it in as you think of it. Don't wait until the very end to submit your question. Finally, this webinar is being recorded. You will find a recording of this webinar, as well as all of our previous webinars, on the CESA website at cesa.org/webinars. And we'll also send you a follow-up email sometime this afternoon with a link to the webinar recording and the slides. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to our host for this webinar, CESA's Project Director, Nate Hausman.
Great. Thank you, Samantha. And before I turn the presentation over to Beren and Ben, I just briefly want to tell you who the Clean Energy States Alliance is and what our Sustainable Solar Education Project is all about. So here on this slide, in case you're not familiar with us, the Clean Energy States Alliance, or CESA, is a national nonprofit network of public agencies and organizations working together to advance clean energy. CESA is made up of mostly state agencies, and you can see many of our members, public funders of clean energy initiatives from across the country on this slide. This webinar on standards and requirements for solar equipment installation, licensing, and certification is being conducted as part of our Sustainable Solar Education Project. As Samantha mentioned, that's a CESA-run project to help state and municipal officials ensure that distributed solar electricity remains consumer-friendly and benefits low and moderate-income households. Through our Sustainable Solar Education Project, we're developing a variety of resources for state and municipal officials on topics related to solar consumer protection and solar equitability. The project is funded from the U.S. Department of Energy's Sunshot Initiative. That's their Solar Training and Education for Professionals program. In addition to the guides and webinars we're producing under the project, we also release a free monthly e-newsletter that contains resources and upcoming activities related to solar equitability and solar consumer protection from across the country. You can sign up for that e-newsletter through CESA's Sustainable Solar Education Project webpage, and you can see the web address on the screen. So as you'll hear, today's webinar on standards and requirements for solar equipment installation and licensing and certification is based on a recently released guide on the topic. It's written by Beren Argetsinger and Ben Inskeep, and we've got Beren and Ben with us here today. So without further ado, let me turn it over to them and let me introduce them. Beren Argetsinger is an associate with Keys & Fox, LLP. Beren's practice centers on advancing and defending policies that support the development and integration of distributed energy resources and other clean energy technologies through regulatory proceedings and other forums. Beren received his Juris Doctor, magna cum laude, with a certificate in environmental law from the Elizabeth Hubb School of Law at Pace University and a Master's of Environmental Management from the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies at Yale University. And also with us is Benjamin Inskeep, who is a research analyst at EQ Research, LLC. Benjamin conducts research and analysis on rapidly evolving clean and distributed energy policies and markets for EQ Research's policy tracking and consulting services. Ben received his Master's of Public Affairs and Master's of Science in Environmental Science degrees from the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. So with that, let me pass it over to Beren and Ben.
All right. Can you hear us, Nate?
Sure can.
All right. Hi, everybody. This is Ben Inskeep on the line. I'll pass it over to Beren in a little bit, but I'm going to start off with the first section here. Thanks for joining us today. Let me get the slideshow started here. All right. Quickly, I just wanted to introduce where we work. First of all, Beren is an attorney at Keys & Fox. Keys & Fox is a law firm, and they specialize in distributed generation and renewable energy law. And the attorneys there have appeared before 40 state public utility commissions to advance clean energy policies. I work at EQ Research. We're a consulting firm, and we provide policy research, analysis, and other services to businesses active in the clean energy industry. And our subscription services include comprehensively tracking policy developments around the country related to clean energy. Beren and I are coming to you today from Cary, North Carolina, but we also have offices in Denver and Oakland, and our two organizations work closely together on a number of things. So today we're going to be talking to you a little bit about the codes and standards that ensure rooftop solar PV systems are, first of all, properly installed, second, that they're installed by qualified people, and then third, that the PV system equipment itself delivers as promised. So these are going to be the three topics. First, I'm going to dive into installation codes related to solar PV, including building codes, fire codes, and electrical codes. So to start off, some of the broader issues to consider when looking at solar in these codes are here on this first slide. First of all, something to consider is whether or not your existing codes either have restrictive language or ambiguous language as it relates to solar PV. Both of these can be issues because without, for example, without having clear language of how solar applies to certain codes, it can be very difficult for a contractor or installer to figure out how to be in compliance. So if they can't figure out how to be in compliance, they might not be coming to your area. Second of all, restrictive language might take a number of forms, but it will tend to prevent solar development that you would otherwise want. So that's the first thing to consider. Next is your lag time between updating your codes. The building, fire, and electrical codes I'll be talking about shortly all have a 3-year update cycle where they are updated with revisions based on the latest best practices, and they go through a whole stakeholder process in order to achieve those model codes. So states vary in terms of how long it takes before they adopt those updates, or even if they adopt those updates. And so if you're not updating codes on a regular basis, you could be missing out on key changes as the technology matures, as markets mature, and as new and evolving issues are addressed. Third, variation across jurisdiction in codes can be an issue for solar installers and contractors because they often operate across these jurisdictional lines. It's not just in a city or county, but often they're working in a whole region in the state, across the entire state, or even across multiple states. And so the more variation you have within codes and across codes, the more difficult and costly it could be to comply with those and to make sure that they're meeting all those specific needs. That's not to say that local jurisdictions and states should not feel free to make revisions or specific amendments to model codes. It's just a consideration that you will want to keep in mind when considering adopting something that has not been adopted in other jurisdictions or could be perceived as restrictive. And then last is your consistency in enforcement. Enforcement plays a big role in how these codes are implemented and the degree to which they can either enhance the solar market or create a barrier. And so training and ensuring your inspectors and other code officials are well aware of the specifics of the codes as they pertain to solar specifically and are then consistently applying those across the jurisdiction are also important things to consider. So let's dive into some of the specifics here. We're going to be covering a lot of different topics today, so we're not going to have a chance to dive into the nitty-gritty details of everything. I don't think you would want us to dive into the nitty-gritty details of all of these things because they do get technical or specific, but you should feel free to refer to the guide for more details or follow up with questions in your chat box, as Nate and Sam pointed out earlier. So your building codes are designed to have a minimum set of requirements related to a number of things for solar. Basically, you don't want solar creating issues with the panels falling off the roof, creating structural issues where they're creating such a burden in terms of the engineering and structure of the roof that it could lead to collapse. In that your materials in your fire classification aren't creating other issues such as spreading a fire quicker. So these are the types of issues in the building codes as they relate to solar, and they are updated every 3 years. How it actually can be implemented in order to enhance the solar market it hits on a couple things. First, your building codes could include specific provisions to encourage, incentivize, or require buildings be solar ready. What do we mean by a solar ready building? Well, when your community is expanding its building stock, when you're building new houses, commercial buildings, keeping in mind the fact that solar might go up on those buildings in the future and planning for that in advance with the design of the buildings, with the documentation around its engineering and structural ability to hold solar, and even the way your building is oriented, whether it's in a north-south orientation, can all play a role in terms of how solar-friendly that building will then be in the future. This can actually, cut down costs by a considerable amount because, old buildings that you have to then retrofit later in the future in order to be able to put up a PV system can actually add a substantial cost. And that north-south orientation, I should point out, is important, just in case folks out there aren't aware. That south-facing part of your roof is the prime real estate for solar. That's where it's going to generate the most energy in general. And so that's why a north-south orientation, for example, could incentivize solar. And so these solar-ready provisions take a number of flavors. In the model codes now adopted by the International Code Council, there is an optional appendix relating to solar-ready buildings. A number of cities and states have adopted specific requirements that new building stock be solar-ready, which they have specific recommendations or requirements in how a building is designated as solar-ready. One example is California, and they have 4 cities there that have even gone above and beyond the state's requirement to be solar-ready. They've actually required solar on new buildings. And there's even pending legislation now statewide that would adopt that would say that the portion of the building roof that's designated to have a future rooftop solar system would actually have to even have a rooftop solar system at the point of installation. So there's a number of different ways. Obviously, cities and states don't need to go to that extent in order to encourage solar. Just simply having good information about your buildings and about how solar could fit in the future will help with that. And then permitting and inspection are really critical issues to consider for solar as they pertain to building codes, because your typical solar installation, rooftop solar installation, is going to need a building permit. And how quickly and easy it is to get that building permit can really either enhance or be a barrier to that specific local solar market. One of the most intriguing things I think that Beren and I heard when doing this guidebook from stakeholders was one program, I believe, in Connecticut, where they are providing local assistance to local governments, and where they found a lot of success was just sitting down with some of these building officials and having them list out their specific process of how a building permit is granted for a solar system. Just by looking at their the way they currently do business and making that internal process explicit, a lot of local governments there have been able to identify ways on their own of how they can streamline that process, reduce timelines, and otherwise improve that experience. So there's a lot of great resources out there. I'll just quickly point out that the Interstate Renewable Energy Council has put out a lot of great resources on streamlining permitting inspection, as have a number of states, including California, New York, and Connecticut, among others. And now I want to quickly touch on fire and electrical codes before I pass it over to Beren to get into licensing and certification. I've highlighted here on this slide some setbacks from the edge of the roof here for this solar system. These setbacks are a critical part of fire codes. When we think about solar and fire codes, our main issue is mitigating those potential hazards related to first responders and firefighters coming on site in doing their firefighting operations, which could potentially include, going up on a roof. And so that PV equipment could get in their way or could create additional hazards if they're not being considered in the fire codes in a meaningful way. The International Fire Code has some specific guidelines as it relates to the pathways, the spacing between your rooftop arrays, and setbacks on the roof. But a number of jurisdictions, have either adopted these specific guidelines or have worked collaboratively with stakeholders, including the solar industry and firefighters in their community, to modify these and tweak them. One of the concerns from a solar industry perspective would be, each time you are restricting roof space for pathways or setbacks, for example, that's space you can't use for a solar system. So there's a trade-off there where you want to make sure, you have the firefighters have the ability to conduct the operations they need to do in an emergency situation while still allowing for rooftop space for a PV system. So that's a little bit of the trade-off at play. When it comes to electrical codes, again, safety is the issue here. We want PV systems that are designed and installed in a way that's going to be safe, not just for the person doing installation, but also for first responders in the future, for the homeowner, and other contractors and installers who might be doing operations and maintenance on that system, who come along in the future who weren't the folks that did it to begin with. They need to know the system is up to code, and that will help them know what to expect and conduct those operations safely. The National Electrical Code has been widely adopted across the United States, and the last few code cycles have involved a lot of discussions with the solar industry on specific solar issues, including recently the 2017 National Electrical Code was adopted. It's already in effect, or being adopted at least in Massachusetts, and a number of other states are considering or going through that process themselves to go with the 2017 version of this code. Some of the big issues in the electrical codes for PV include specific electrical specifications that are very technical, but also things like signage and labeling. That's just critical in order to for folks like first responders to know that a PV system is on site, so that they can properly mitigate that risk, and also just so future electrical work, for example, on the system is done safely. Perhaps the biggest issue that's been brought up for PV for the PV industry in the last two code cycles has been a provision called rapid shutdown. Basically, this is just a provision that is trying to ensure first responders have the ability to very quickly reduce that voltage from a PV system in order to conduct their firefighting operation safely. So why is this important? Well, when a firefighter gets on scene, one of the first things they do is cut off utilities to the site. They want to close up the gas line. They want to open that circuit breaker to make sure there's no electricity flowing to the house, to mitigate that electrocution risk. That's a lot more complicated when you have a PV system on the roof with all this electrical equipment that could be being energized at the time, even if you open up that circuit breaker, even if that electricity is shut off from the grid, those panels are still generating electricity if sun's hitting it. And so the industry and firefighters associations have been working to create standards that both improve safety to firefighters in these situations while not being overly burdensome for the industry in terms of being able to have equipment that complies with it and is not overly expensive. So our key recommendations and considerations when looking at these codes, first of all, just a simple awareness among your firefighters and your building code officials, your permitting staff of PV systems in your community is really critical, especially if you're located somewhere where there's not that much PV adoption so far. Then one thing you want to consider is ensuring plenty of training opportunities so that both firefighters and building officials have the latest information and are aware of the safety considerations. And that means training not just standard training during daytime hours in your capital cities, but some of the feedback we got was also consider things like volunteer firefighters who have day jobs. They might need night and weekend trainings. Consider having incentives to encourage people to get to the trainings, including continuing education credits, or even food was something we heard over and over for program managers as the simplest and most effective way to boost attendance at trainings. Throughout these code adoption processes, an inclusive stakeholder process can be really helpful to getting a lot of feedback from stakeholders, both in, for example, the solar industry, as well as your firefighters, your building code officials. Make sure contentious issues are brought to light and there's an opportunity to gather input on what potential issues there could be in those model codes that are affecting both stakeholder groups or more stakeholder groups than just both of those. Look at those model codes as a starting point and then consider adaptations to your specific local jurisdiction that might apply, and provide clear and consistent code enforcement and transparent processes for both finding information and then appealing enforcement actions if necessary. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Beren to talk about licensing and certification.
Great, thanks Ben, and thanks again Nate and Sam, and thanks everybody for joining us. So in this section in licensing and certification, some of the key areas sort of that we'll touch on here in electrical licensing that impact solar PV installations, and then we'll go over some considerations and recommendations that we heard from talking with folks in the industry and with public agencies and others. So some key areas that we'll touch on, sort of the differences between whether the licensing process, the standards requirements are administered at the state or the local level, the type of license required to work as an electrician. So, for instance, the difference between sort of a more general or a journeyman's electrician's license that would allow the licensee to perform most all electrical work, compared to a more limited license that might limit the type of electrical work that a person is allowed to perform and might preclude them from performing other types of electrical work. So for instance, a limited license specific to solar PV. Another area that we'll touch on that's really important as it relates to what an electrician is required to do for solar PV installations is the implications of the definition of electrical work. So in other words, what aspects of a solar installation are defined as electrical work, and how that sort of what those requirements mean in terms of whether a licensed electrician has to perform that work, or that person's supervisee or apprentice, or whether a non-licensed person is able to perform that work, and what some of the implications of that are. And then we'll also talk a little bit about ratio requirements of licensed electricians to non-licensed apprentice electricians again, and some of the issues that kind of arise out of that relate to those definitions of electrical work and the types of licensing. And then we'll also talk a little bit about third-party certification. So as opposed to the license itself, which the third-party or other types of certification that are distinct from licensing. We'll talk about how states and local governments, solar program managers have incorporated these certification requirements into their solarized programs or incentive programs, and just talk over a couple of examples of how kind of the licensing and certification play together as it relates to solar. Licensing and certification, sort of generally speaking, licensing, they're credentialing tools for states and municipalities to use to ensure that the person or the firm performing electrical work on a home or a business, what have you, possess the qualifications, competence, and expertise to provide the electrical services that the customer is seeking. So in this case, installing your solar. So the license is a grant of it's a legal authority that indicates the person holding the license is qualified to perform the work. And in most states, this is a mandatory requirement and usually administered at the state level. Some states administer licensing requirements at the local level, and even a very few states allow local jurisdictions to set the requirements themselves. So actually New York is an example of that. And we'll talk a little bit about New York in that context and the certification when we talk a little bit more about certifications as well. Two of the licenses that we'll talk about is kind of general categories of licenses that impact solar PV. I think that are important to distinguish is the more general electrician license that I mentioned before, sort of the journeyman license that's typically referred to in a lot of states, and then the more limited electrician license that allows the holder to perform more limited electrical work, so just solar installation, but maybe not other electrical work. And then for certification, as I mentioned, it's more of a voluntary credentialing mechanism as opposed to the license where it's required. The certification is like more of a supplement to that license, and some states might require that as an additional credential for participating in certain programs, but it's not the requirement in the way that a license would be required for doing your electrical installations. So with that, we will move on to kind of dive in a little bit to the licensing issue specifically. As I mentioned, there's kind of two boxes of it to think of it as a category of general and limited. And the table on this slide gives you some examples of of a few different states that we just kind of highlight here for the training requirements that a person has to meet a licensed journeyman electrician to be able to take the test and to become a licensed electrician in a state. So for example, you can see the training requirements are pretty significant. The classroom hours and on-job experience in the examples we put up here don't really vary a whole lot, but you can see that to get a journeyman license requires 4 years of on-the-job training and often classroom experience as well. And I'll just note here, kind of keep those numbers in mind in that minimum training required column for comparison with the next slide when we talk a little bit about the limited electrician licensing to sort of compare what those on-the-job training numbers look like between these two different types of licenses. Before we move on to that, another area I think is important to highlight in the right-hand column of the table, it shows the ratio requirement for a licensed electrician to a non-licensed apprentice, and you'll see that, so for instance, in Idaho, a licensed electrician is permitted to oversee 3 non-licensed apprentices, while Wisconsin and Massachusetts, for example, that ratio is 1-to-1. Some of the practical implications of these ratios, depend on a number of factors, but one key factor is that definition of electrical work that we referenced earlier. So any part of the PV installation that is defined as electrical work has to be completed by the licensed electrician or that person's apprentice that they're overseeing. Important to note that the definition of electrical work might vary by state, just as the licensing requirements may vary, and you can see in that column on the right, the ratio requirements may vary as well. So as one example, Massachusetts, almost all aspects of the solar installation are deemed electrical work, from mounting the panels, installing the inverter, to completing the final grid tie-in, are all considered electrical work, which means that a licensed electrician is required to perform all of that work. Whereas in other states, the definition of which aspects of the installation are considered electrical work are more limited. So this impacts, which parts of that installation the licensed electrician has to perform. The the implications of these specific requirements and the definitions of electrical work are really important considerations to take into account when looking at developing solar programs, setting solar goals for a state or a municipality or other kind of regional area. So for instance, the licensing requirements and the ratio requirements and the definitions of electrical work can impact the implementation of your solar goals, such as the rate of solar adoption. It can impact the available labor, who's allowed to perform this work. And on sort of the other side of that coin, the pathways to increase employment in the solar industry within a state as well, and can also impact, specific to a consumer, the labor costs associated with a PV installation. So if a lot of the work has to be completed by licensed electricians, that labor cost may be higher than if some of that work could be completed by people who were not required to have that license. And then there's, of course, the considerations of how much of that work do you want to have a licensed electrician doing versus a non-electrician, based on the risks associated with that, and making sure that the installations are performed to the standards that they need to be performed to. So with these considerations and others in mind, some states have determined that a person that to do this, you really to do PV installation in the state, that general electrician licensing is required. While other states have determined that maybe more limited license is sufficient to achieve the safety goals and to also meet some of the other solar goals in their state, and have adopted more limited electrician licensing requirements to sort of create that pathway for others who don't have all the requirements to meet for a journeyman license, but meet other requirements that are more specific to PV. So this slide here, it gives a few examples of those kinds of licenses, and here you can see, for instance, that Connecticut and Oregon, the on-the-job training is about half of what it is for that journeyman license that I noted in the slide before. So 4,000 apprentice hours, 2 years as opposed to 4 years. And that allows a person to receive specific training to become a licensed to perform solar installations much more quickly than if they had to get their journeyman license. In Oregon, for example, just the license type for the limited renewable energy technician, that allows the licensee to complete nearly the entire solar installation for systems up to 25 kW, which would cover pretty much all rooftop home residential PV systems. So this would include the mounting the panels, the grounding, the electrical wiring, the inverter, but the technician is not permitted to do the final tie-in, so that requires the fully licensed journeyman to do that final grid tie-in interconnection. So you can kind of see some of the limits to not just outside of solar, but within the solar installation itself, limiting it to certain sizes of PV installations, and also allowing it to do most aspects, but some reserving it for still the more fully qualified electrician. So the limited license is just another tool for states to ensure that qualified individuals and firms, doing your solar installations, they actually meet the standards that are needed to perform safely and to code, but have determined, that the full training requirements of maybe meeting the journeyman license are not necessary to meet those safety and code standards, at least for some aspects of an installation. So that's an overview of the licensing requirements, and there's a lot more detail about those in the guidebook again, and there's additional examples of states that employ some of these different kind of mechanisms, and so you can dive into that in more detail. But for now, we'll just go ahead and move on to some things about certification specifically. And as I mentioned before, certification being another credentialing tool, but more of a voluntary tool as opposed to that mandatory requirement for a license. Certification is often kind of think about it in terms of used by industry as a way to provide additional training, as a means to distinguish an installer from the competition, as ways to sometimes it means accessing state incentive and rebate programs. So there's sort of this maybe quasi, it's not necessarily a requirement, but it might be incorporated as a requirement in state programs, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But just kind of a quick general third-party certification. There are a number of organizations that offer these. NABCEP is probably one of the more well-known ones, but others are listed here as well. The Electrical Training Alliance, Underwriters Laboratory, and also important to note that it's not just third-party, but states also may adopt their own certification programs, and the Oregon Solar Trade Ally program is an example of that, and you can find more detail about the Solar Trade Ally program in the guidebook as well, where we talk about that a little bit more detail. So one area, though, that I did want to touch on with respect to certification is that the idea that states and localities, we often use that third party or the certification as a additional credential to the licensing as part of incorporating it into the solar program. So as we mentioned before, it's a voluntary mechanism, but when it's incorporated into these programs as a prerequisite to accessing certain solar rebates or other financial incentives, tying that eligibility to participate with those programs to the firm or individual holding that certification can be a way for state agencies or government local jurisdictions to condition participation in their program on specific training that's associated with these third-party certifications, specifically where those programs may not have the authority to condition licenses or to set licensing requirements for installers. So third-party certifications are often used to set sort of these additional requirements. And a couple of examples of that are so in New York, for instance, where local jurisdictions set the licensing requirements, and where some have no licensing requirements, actually. To be eligible for participation in the state rebate programs, however, so that are administered by NYSERDA, so for instance, the New York Sun program, NYSERDA requires third-party certification for the contractors, which creates some uniformity in the qualifications of the people who are performing your installation, and that's even though NYSERDA doesn't have authority to require electrical licensing per se, can use the third-party certification as a means of making sure that the installers who are accessing these rebates for their customers are meeting certain credentialing. Ohio is another great example where contractors that perform electrical work must obtain a license from the state, and local jurisdictions can require registration, but they don't have the authority to issue or condition a license. But in the instances where they adopt local solarized programs or have rebates or incentives, they can condition those things like NYSERDA does on third-party certification, and the city of Cincinnati is a great example of that adopted its own program and called the Solarized Cincy program, and requires contractors to obtain third-party certification as a condition for participation. And there's more examples of these kinds of things in the guidebook, and I encourage you to look at those if you have more interest in that. But for now, I think we'll go ahead and move on to just a couple of other just last items in the licensing and certification that we'll just touch on quickly. And those are contractor lists and installer databases. These are kind of guides to help to direct consumers to contractors, might be able to help them out with their solar installation needs. And they vary by state depending on the goals of the database or the list. Some states are kind of more like a directory style, and others offer more of a they list the businesses that actually qualify or are eligible to participate in a state incentive or rebate program. And so I think the key takeaway here really is that while there are differences in these, it's important for customers to know the differences, and states can really help out with that by just making really clear what the list or the database's goals are, and being transparent about whether or not it's literally just a directory, and there's no assessment of whether or not the businesses qualify for certain rebates or other criteria, or if that is in fact the goal of the database. And so just a couple of notes on that, and there's some more on that in the guidebook as well if folks are interested. Some key just kind of recommendations and considerations and things that we got takeaways from talking with people developing this section. State and local circumstances vary, and there's no one-size-fits-all for developing licensing standards or adopting certification as additional requirements. But I think one key takeaway, though, is that monitoring technological advances in solar equipment can be really helpful in thinking through whether or not licensing requirements are overly restrictive or are still totally valid for achieving the goals of that jurisdiction. I think just one example, I guess, that we'd offer is certain aspects of an installation that maybe used to be more labor-intensive and required more traditional hands-on electrical work, connecting panels or doing the grounding specifically that you needed the person to be doing it. If those things have changed because of how the panels, the racking mounts, or other components are designed now, that would be useful probably to know in terms of defining what constitutes electrical work now, and whether that the licensing requirements may be overly restrictive, or if other changes have happened that maybe the licensing requirements need to be broadened to capture changes in that technology as well. And so, and then the others that we just talked about, third-party certification as a useful tool for program developers, and then providing that clear and transparency in those contractor lists are helpful for both consumers and contractors. And so with that, I think I'll hand it over back to Ben, who will talk about warranties and standards.
Great. Well, I'm cognizant of our time here, so I do want to move through this quickly just to make sure we do have time for questions today. So let me dive here into some of the details of the warranties and equipment standards that we want to talk about. From a big picture, you have both third-party standards and state-mandated standards when it comes to your PV system equipment itself. Two of the maybe most important ones, or ones I definitely want to highlight for third-party standards, would be the Underwriter Laboratories product safety standards. They're widely used across the country. They do testing, and they develop product safety standards to make sure PV equipment, as well as other equipment, meets specific standards. And then the IEEE standards, particularly 1547, relates to the interconnection standard that's been widely adopted in state interconnection standards, and sets the process for doing that. State-mandated standards typically are a little bit different flavor. The most commonly used one, the California Energy Commission Equipment Standards List, has been widely adopted actually by a lot of other states. They just say, hey, look what California does. That's going to be our, if it's on their list, then it's eligible for our specific program or incentive. When it comes to warranties, something to consider when developing an incentive program or a solarized program, for example, bulk solar purchasing, are what types of warranties should be required in order to be eligible in the program, or and this keep in mind is kind of a minimum set of standards. So the difference here is manufacturer warranties are focused specifically on kind of product defects, ensuring that the product meets with respect to the performance warranty, it isn't degrading over time too quickly. So for solar panels, the common performance warranty standard is a 25-year warranty where the panel is guaranteed not to degrade to the point where you're getting less than 80% of the rated capacity output. In comparison, workmanship warranties are often, but not always, offered by the installers and contractors that are installing the panels, and that'll cover things like labor defects and other minor equipment. I shouldn't say minor, but equipment other than, for example, your inverter or your PV modules is often covered under workmanship warranties. And then kind of a similar thing, but not specifically a warranty, is a production guarantee that we're seeing a number of companies, particularly your third-party owned system companies, offer. So when they give customers a quote saying we expect this system to generate this much energy in a year, if it doesn't generate that much energy, then customers have an ability to go to them and say, hey, the system's underperforming. We should get compensated for that difference, within a reasonable margin of error, which these things altogether can kind of provide customers with, a baseline level of protection and assurance that their specific equipment and system is going to operate as advertised, and if there are issues that come up down the line, there's some sort of recourse. Another big picture thing to think about, though, is also what is and what isn't covered in your warranties. So you might have a program design that requires, for example, a workmanship warranty or a manufacturer warranty, but then take a manufacturer warranty, maybe there is an issue with a piece of equipment, and you take advantage of that warranty, you get a new module to replace a broken one, but does that warranty cover the cost of labor, for example? Or if it doesn't, the customer might be responsible then for that cost of actually installing that panel. So that's just one kind of big picture thing to think about and how these interplay. So to wrap up, some general considerations when it comes to these equipment standards and warranties are, the big one is make sure there's clear information for contractors and consumers about what equipment standards and warranty requirements apply. Particularly if it's a voluntary program and you want to solicit wide participation, you want to make sure you have very clear program standards. When evaluating existing government and third-party standards, solicit stakeholder participation in this as well. Make sure these issues are continuing to evolve. It seems like over time a lot of these warranties, for example, are getting longer. Companies are being more, are developing better and better equipment and are offering longer warranties. So consider that over time. This is stuff that changes and can change rapidly. So make sure you're considering that when you're factoring in a decision on what kind of warranty you want to be offered. And then I guess I'm not going to go through each of these conclusions and key takeaways, but I'll slide back to this here in 1 second as we take questions. But first of all, I just want to say thank you all for joining us today, and please do feel free to reach out to us with any follow-up questions. Our emails are on the slide deck. And with that, Nate, I would like to maybe turn it back over to you to see if we have any questions out there.
Great. Thank you, Beren and Ben. Thanks for your presentations, and many thanks for putting together this great resource guide for us. So yeah, let's open it up to questions. If you haven't already, type your questions into the chat box on your screen, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. We've already got some great questions that have come in. And so, yeah, let me just start here. Are you aware of any publicly available data on how third-party certification affects solar installers' business success or affects inspection rates, those kinds of things? And well, maybe I'll stop there, and it's a two-part question, and I've got another part for you, but I'll let you answer that first part first.
Hey, this is Ben. No, I'm not aware off the top of my head of that information, other than what's in the guidebook on that. So that's a great question, though. At least a great research question that somebody should be answering out there.
Agreed. I'm not aware of anything either. Do you know of any states that offer funding for solar professionals that seek third-party certifications? Are there any states that are offering a carrot in that way?
Off the top of my head, I'm not aware of specific examples, but that does seem like something I've come across. So I would recommend for your specific state, asking around on that. But off the top of my head, I can't recall a specific example for you.
This is Beren. I'd just add to that in our conversations, that was something that that was mentioned more than a couple times as something that would be a good thing to adopt would be to provide resources to help out with that additional training. And so if it's not happening in a state currently, it certainly appears to be something that folks are thinking about and think would be beneficial.
Agreed, and I think if there was publicly available data on some of that stuff on the inspection rates for people that have had some kind of third-party certification versus not, that might help encourage that kind of thing. Here's a question about solar ready. Someone asks, please discuss the east-west orientation on roofs and what situations might make this a good choice. I mean, it seems like it seems like by requiring northwest orientation that could really restrict development. Is that true?
Oh, certainly. And sorry, my broader point on that was not to say, every building, ever built from now on has to be north-south facing. It's more, thinking about maybe potential carrots to offer, and at least, educating developers on the benefits of the more closely north-south oriented a building could be, and ensuring that your kind of south-facing roof area is equipment-free. Those kind of things can help encourage solar development and can help maximize that potential down the line to expand solar. So, certainly, I wasn't trying to be prescriptive and say that buildings shouldn't be oriented in other positions. Obviously, there's going to be a number of factors to consider when designing a building, and you can't always you can't always fit it north-south oriented. But it is something that if if is explicitly attention is drawn to, and developers are aware of that factor, I think that could be a positive way to encourage that consideration. And one quick thing I'll add on that is, in some jurisdictions too, there is being more talk about the potential to encourage more systems to be west-facing. This is particularly relevant in areas where you have kind of later in the day peak loads, and in other words, the solar generation later in the afternoon is really valuable because it's offsetting the most expensive energy that's being generated. And so, we might be seeing, the beginnings of that, where more and more utilities and jurisdictions are going to look towards incentivizing west-facing solar installations in order to take advantage of that very valuable energy in those places. But there is the drawback of that is that it tends to reduce the overall output in terms of kilowatt hours generated over time. It's just a matter of whether or not the timing of that generation is a concern to that utility or your jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. Very helpful. This is a question about how much state certification programs, either states that have their own certification programs or states that adopt other third-party certification programs, how widely do they vary? Is there some uniformity there that you're seeing, that, some common threads, or is it widely disparate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there is a considerable amount of uniformity just in terms of the states that adopt third-party certification or other kinds of certifications, and that the organizations which are acceptable certification credentialers are often similar among states. The requirements for having that certification are often tied to the state-specific or local jurisdiction-specific, which was the example of Solarized Cincy in Cincinnati. They're tying rebate programs or incentive programs or the ability to participate in those programs to a contractor or the installer having those certifications active and to be able to participate in those programs. So it seems that the structure of them are similar in that way. There's going to be some differences in the programs, of course, but I think to the question there are quite a few similarities.
Great, thanks. Now a specific question about some of the newer technology we're seeing in terms of solar shingles and standing seam roofing that go, some of the products that go roof to roof, and how those are treated in updated electrical and fire codes. Do you know that in jurisdictions that have, updated electrical, do you know how those kinds of systems are treated? In other words, can you go roof to roof?
That's an issue I did not dive deep into. In this guidebook, it was much more focused on, your typical kind of roof-mounted system as opposed to like building integrated or solar shingles. Those, issues are addressed, I believe, in the code. I know the building code specifically has, specific requirements for building integrated PV, and I know there's, code compliance with fire codes for example, solar shingles, I'm personally less familiar with, so I don't think I could add much to that immediately right now here on the call.
This is Beren. I would just highlight though that that's such an excellent question, and it really highlights one of the areas that we heard a lot of from folks is that the technology is always advancing, and it's difficult for the codes to keep up with that. And so it's important for folks who are looking at these codes when they're looking at adopting them to consider those kinds of things that was brought up in this question specifically, and say, does the model code maybe that we're looking at specifically address some of the technological advances that have come out since this code was developed, and do we need to make some adjustments in here? And that's where I think some of those ideas around, as you're looking at those codes, to really get that stakeholder input to make sure that your codes are considering some of these new things that maybe have just recently developed and there's not a lot of experience with yet, but you can stay ahead of the game by making sure that you're getting that input as much as you can, so that you can maybe modify those to incorporate changes that might be necessary to ensure your safety and codes for these new technologies that were not really considered maybe in some of the when the other codes were developed.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, that sometimes the technology is evolving even faster than the codes, even codes that are adopted, or considered every 3 years. That things are really moving quickly. Well, we're getting close to the top of the hour here, and so our hour together will come to a close. We've got a lot of great questions, and I'm not possibly going to be able to get to all of them. Maybe I'll ask one or two more. Here's a question about nationwide uniformity in the National Electric Code, and just sort of an observation that maybe one of or both of you may want to comment on. Why isn't there uniformity across the board on how these are adopted, or why isn't this done at a national level rather than at the state level?
Well, specifically on the electrical codes, those are widely, extremely, widespreadly adopted across the United States. There's much more variation in your fire codes and your building codes than with the electrical codes, from my understanding. And even within states, each state has a different flavor in terms of how much, jurisdiction they then pass along to local governments. Some states, they have a statewide electrical code or statewide building code. Other states, these things are left to local jurisdictions, and often, regardless, inspection occurs and enforcement occurs at the local level. So, I think it, maybe to, pontificate a little more broadly, I think it goes to, in the United States, just our kind of our federalism and our, kind of trends towards, delegating certain powers to the states and local governments. So it's an interesting thing to consider and compare to other countries, for example, that might have more uniformity. And I think it's it's a great issue to consider when you're going through your code code adoption cycles yourself.
Great, thanks. Well, it's 2 o'clock here on the East Coast on my end, and so I do want to be respectful of your time. There are some other great questions that we didn't get to, but I want to thank everybody, and I particularly want to thank you, Beren and Ben, and before closing out here, I just wanted to see if you have any concluding or parting remarks before we go.
Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us today. And I think, as we mentioned a couple times with the slides, I hope this was a helpful presentation. But for more info, please absolutely check out the Clean Energy States Alliance website, and you can download the guidebook there. And as Ben mentioned, happy to for anyone to reach out to us if you have follow-up questions as well. So thank you again.
Great. Thanks, gentlemen. And to the audience, we hope you join us on future CISA webinars. We'll be conducting another Sustainable Solar Education Project webinar on solar plus storage for low and moderate income communities. That'll be on Thursday, March 16th, which will explore some policy tools that enable low and moderate income residents to reap the benefits of solar plus storage. And that'll be based on another forthcoming guide on the topic, which will be authored by Todd Olinsky-Paul. So we hope you'll join us for that one. And now I'll send it back over to you, Samantha, for a closeout.
Thanks, Nate, and thanks everybody for joining us for this webinar. As you can see on your screen, there is some contact information if you'd like to follow up with any more questions. We encourage you to sign up for our newsletter and find us online. And we hope we'll see you at the next webinar. Thanks.